Okay, so in this video we're going to look at specifically type of and NaN, which are two things that you may come across in JavaScript that slightly confuse to some level. So we'll be looking at a basic overview of what these things are. The first thing we'll look at is type of and how we can use this to check for undefined values. Now we can use type of for lots of other different things, but in this video we're going to focus specifically on undefined and NaN. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside of my code, I've got my index.html file with my app.js included. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create two numbers, so number 1 and number 2. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to create a variable called result, which is undefined at the moment. So if I was to go ahead and refresh in my browser and type result, you'll see that we get this undefined value. It's not a string, it's not a boolean, it's just its own value. It's a weird JavaScript quirk that just means it's not defined. It hasn't had a value set to it. And remember, that's different to if we hadn't actually explicitly defined that the variable would exist. So if I now type in result, it says reference error, result is not defined. So this is actually just not defined at all, so we can't actually do anything to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to include the result variable because we know that we're going to set a value to it. It's always good to set all of your variable values at the top of whatever you're doing. It just means that you've got all the variables there, you can set values to them later on. Now what we're going to do is, because result is currently undefined, we're going to go and perform a check under here to check if result isn't defined or not. Now this is a really basic script. There's no real use to this. It doesn't matter too much in terms of sort of how this is working and why we're doing this. But let's go ahead and create a quick if statement. Now I'm going to use the type of operator to say if type of something, result, is equal to undefined. Now this is even weirder because this is now a string. So let's just back up a tiny bit and just check what this actually does. So let's do a console.log. In fact, let's do this all within the browser. It makes a lot more sense. So type of result, undefined, now in a string. So type of is giving us the type of this sort of variable. So if I was to say type of number 1, can you guess what it might say? Number in a string. So we can check the type of different values. We could do the same with a boolean if we wanted to, and everything else. So what we're going to now do in our code is we're going to say if type of result equals undefined, and this is just doing type checking as well, so we're checking that this is also a string as well. Then we're going to say result equals number 1 plus number 2. So we've now checked that if this is a defined variable. Done. Now when I type result, we get 60 because we've done the check, we've added the numbers together. So now we know that we can use type of to check if something is undefined or not. Now this doesn't just go for variables that you create. This goes for elements of a page as well that you might want to select and then check if the type of them is undefined. So you might want to grab an element from a page which may not already exist. So there's a variety of different useful ways of doing this, but the main thing to do is bear in mind the type of check, and you can use type of on anything to check it at any point. Now the other thing we're going to look at now is NaN. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to set result to something that isn't a number. So for example, let's go ahead and set result to a string. So I'm just going to say Alex, for example. So now that we've got the result set to a string, when we type result in here, we get the Alex result back. Now what happens if I try and say divide the result by 2? Now what would you expect if I tried to divide the string Alex by 2? Well, this wouldn't be a number. So let's go ahead and say result divided by 2, NaN. NaN basically is a value that's returned when something isn't a number. So that there's no number that can possibly come out of Alex divided by 2. We could do something like parse int result, Now this provides us with not a number, again, because there's no number in here. The interesting thing is, if I was to type in a 0 here or a 1 here, for example, and I go ahead and do exactly the same thing, we get 1 back. The reason being is that we actually have a number in here. If I was to have a 2 at the end of Alex, for example, and I was to go ahead and refresh and pass int, we still get 1. It's always going to bring back what is available first inside of here. Okay, so let's take a look at another example here, and let's just actually, perform a little if statement. So we know that result isn't a number. So I'm going to say if, and this is just a way of protecting against something that might potentially return an NaN value. I'm going to say if result divided by 2, and I'm going to put that in brackets because I'm going to include a function here, is NaN. Console.log not a number. So this could be sort of user generated input or something like that. Is NaN like this? So lowercase is NaN. So this function will check if something isn't a number or not, if an operation is invalid. And this could go for things like user input, like typing in, say, a user could type in, say, 2 numbers, prompted to type in 2 numbers. And maybe they might enter a letter A for the first number and a 2 for the second number. When they try to divide or whatever operations try to happen, and it doesn't work, it's not a number. Now we can also check things like, well, not check, but we can also sort of slight variation to this. Let's say number 1 is an A and number 2 is 50, and I say number 1 plus number 2. Now what's going to happen here is this is, as well as being an addition, it's also concatenation. So what's going to happen is the result is actually going to be a string, because it's going to take into account the fact that we have a string, and then it's going to pass this and everything like that. So the solution would be that whatever input you take from your user, you always use parse int if you're expecting an int, or parse float if you're expecting a float. Let's just pretend that number 1 and number 2 is user input. Parse int 1, number 1, parse int number 2, and what we'll actually get now is not a number. The reason being that this passed to an int is not a number, and NaN added to 50 is NaN, because it's, there's no number initially, so we can't add anything to it. So any user input that you might take that could potentially end up being a string, you want to validate it, make sure you parse it to an integer or float, or even a boolean, if you're talking about booleans. And that's the way you need to handle that. So if you ever get an NaN value back from anything that you do, and things aren't quite right, you need to make sure that you're parsing the values before you do any calculations or anything like that, any operations on them. So in this video we've looked at type of to check whether an element is of a specific type, and we've specifically looked at doing that with undefined values, that things that might not have been defined, and that could be variables, that could be items on a page that you try and access, which we'll look at a bit later. And we've also looked at a common problem, which is NaN, which stands for not a number, which means something like this, which is passed to an integer, which clearly is not a number. So making sure that you check these things with functions like is NaN will help you along the way.